Hello, welcome to CCJ 3701, Research Methods in Criminology. I'm Dr. Jensen, and this is your second to last lab. This is Lab 7, and these last two labs will get us into the most advanced techniques that we learn in statistics and data analysis, and we're going to do this kind of stepwise together so that we can go through them very carefully. These techniques you will definitely be using in your final paper, so you'll want to make sure you follow them carefully, and if you have questions, please reach out. So I already have login.apps.ufl.edu open, and I'm going to go ahead and launch SPSS statistics. So once the software program opens, we're going to go ahead and go to File, Open, and Data, and of course navigate to the R drive and select Courses, find your course, and the data folder, and then once you're inside the data folder, we're going to go ahead and scroll over to the Add Health Waves 1, 2, 3, 4 merged.sav. So select that file and open it up. Once you're in the file, you can go ahead and adjust your view in SPSS so that way you can see a little bit more at once. And this is a really cool file, if I haven't already told you about it. It's waves 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the first wave was collected in 1994, and then the second wave was 1998. The third wave was 2004, and the last wave was 2008. But then they did a follow-up, and I actually added the follow-up, wave 5, which happened in 2016 or 2018, something like that. But that was the very, very final wave of the data. But it basically follows the same group of people over time, and it's what we call longitudinal data. So you have a cohort or a group that you continue to survey and study over a period of time. Same group of people and different kinds of questions as they age and go forward with their lives. So I'm going to go ahead and go in that bottom left area and toggle over to the variable view and then grab the edge of my label column so I can see a little bit more there. I'm also going to expand the values column a little bit too. So I occasionally get the question from students that asks, hey, we built this variable in a lab and I'm using that same data set for my paper. Can I use that variable for my final paper? The answer is yes, you absolutely can. So again, as long as it fits your topic and it goes into the ways you want to measure something, there's no sense in rebuilding it just for funsies, right? Like you can go ahead and just use that measure that you built. But again, you'll want to save your file and save the variables you make, whether it's scales or recoded variables or what have you, and make sure you have all those variables in one place, in one file. But yeah, anything we make in a lab is perfectly free game for your final paper. Now remember, the other thing you'll need to do is document how that variable was built and the kinds of questions inside it and changes you made to the variable itself, if you recoded anything or combined it together into a scale or made other changes. And that has to go into your methods section. So you may have to revisit that lab to see how to get that information and copy it into your methods section for your final paper. But again, as long as it fits your purpose for your topic, that is perfectly fine. So in this lab, we're interested in building a variable about delinquency. And so I'm going to put my cursor in that label field, and I'm going to search on an item that, oh, sorry, I hit Command F. Sorry, I'm such a Mac user. You need to hit Control F. There we go. Now we can find different word matches inside that field. And we're going to search on the word graffiti. And that's Graffiti. And hit Find Next. And then you can now close this window. But this is a section of the survey that actually brings us to a series of questions that ask kids in the survey about their delinquent behaviors. Now remember, the word graffiti is spray painting or marking up something in a non-artistic, not authorized way. It's essentially vandalism, but that's a good place to start for kids that like to mark up buildings and walls and stuff like that. what's interesting is I used to work in juvenile probation, and if we found graffiti and we figured out the kid that did it, they got to paint the wall, right? That was part of their rehabilitation. They had to go make repairs and fix the damage that they did as a condition of their probation. So I saw some very interesting graffiti over the years that kids would do. So let's take a look at these other behaviors. So I'm going to go ahead and put my cursor on the entire row, starting on row 1802, and the variables H1, DS1. So if I keep scrolling down using Shift and the down arrow, I'll get to the series of questions. I'm actually going to stop at H1, DS15. So this is a series of delinquency questions that they asked kids. And you notice at the end of the variable label for each question, there's a little dash W1. That stands for wave 1. So I know that this is from the first wave when all of these kids were ages 11 to 17 or 18. There might be a handful of 19-year-olds in here too, but these are kids that are in their adolescent years being asked these questions. So let's take a look at these questions. So right here, in the past 12 months, have you painted graffiti? In the past 12 months, have you damaged property? Have you lied to your parents about your whereabouts? Okay, to be honest, I don't necessarily like that question as a part of a delinquency scale because I think it's pretty normal for kids to occasionally lie to mom and dad. It's kind of part of being a teenager, and they don't always share things or are forthcoming with mom and dad. It's kind of pretty normal teenage behavior kind of stuff. However, if you constantly lie or you do a lot of lying, then yeah, that's going to create a lot of trouble for yourself and other problems. So tracking the lying is probably pretty useful, but again, I'm kind of like, really? You think kids that lie are delinquent? Okay, if the kid says they never lie to their parents, they're basically lying. You know, that's kind of how I think about it. But anyway, so again, I think lying happens, but if you make a habit out of it and it becomes kind of your modus operandi, your go-to behavior, then you have other problems. Then we have other questions that ask about shoplifting, getting into a serious physical fight, seriously injuring someone, running away from home, stealing a car. In the past 12 months, have you stolen something worth more than $50? Have you burglarized a building, used or threatened with a weapon, sold drugs, stealing something worth less than $50? That's more like petty theft. Taking part in a group fight, or being loud or rowdy in a public place. So the last one has to do with loitering, which is a common one when we get into delinquency. Now, there are a lot of good delinquent behaviors in this list. So we have running away, because yes, we care about that when it comes to juveniles. We have some other things like drugs and weapons and things. But you don't have things in here like underage drinking, right? So this is not the most exhaustive list, but it's got a lot of good variation to it with property crime, personal injury crime, status offenses. So it's probably a pretty good start. But realize there are plenty of other questions you can ask and find in the data set that would get you even more information about delinquent behavior. So again, this is a good start, but there are other behaviors you could consider. Another one that's a status offense that is commonly used in delinquency variables is something like being truant or skipping school. Again, these are behaviors like running away from home, skipping school, underage drinking, that really only adolescents are flagged for and can do, because we don't care if you get super drunk as an adult, unless you create other problems by getting drunk. If you want to get drunk at home, you can. If you're over 21, we don't care. If you run away from home, we don't care about that either. But if juveniles do it, we do care, right? So status offenses often lead to other problematic behaviors or put a juvenile at risk for victimization, right? So that's why we care about status offenses with kids. They're in a vulnerable time of life and they need to be protected. So sometimes these behaviors are linked together too. So anyway, so that's just something to consider. If you want to make another delinquency variable for your study, you may want to consider pulling in maybe a few more items. Some other topics you may also want to consider are things like sex trafficking, prostitution, having sex for drugs or money, and certainly other things, right? Those are available in the data set if you want to use them. So just make sure that you have a lot of good variety in your series of questions, that you're getting good mileage out of those questions, so that you can have a comprehensive measure of the topic you're doing. So this goes back to those concepts that we talked about, operationalization and conceptualization. So think about how you want to define delinquency and the behaviors you want to include, and then how you want to measure it, right? You could put a lot more drug use in this variable, for example. You could put individual drug use or, other things like that. So again, just more to keep in mind if you want to take this variable further. When we first encounter these 15 variables, they're all separate variables, right? They're in separate lines. They're all measured separately. And I'll just click on the first line right here. The value labels for this line are never, 1 or 2 times, 3 or 4 times, 5 or more times, refused, don't know, not applicable. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just maybe run some frequencies. And again, you can use your down key and your shift, highlight all of them at once, and go ahead and right click and ask for descriptive statistics. So here's our output. And again, I'll just center this on the screen so you can see. But right here, we have the kids that responded to those categories of answers and, you know, in the different frequencies, right? So keep in mind when it comes to delinquency, especially the really serious stuff, most kids don't get into that, right? There's a few kids that get into it once or twice. It's kind of part of being a kid. And very few kids that have done it 5 or more times, okay? So we do have some missing data on these questions. And something else to keep in mind is as the questions kind of get more sensitive or more invasive, you'll get a lot more missing data because sometimes kids start going, well, I'm not going to tell you that, right? Or they skip the question, they refuse to answer, and so forth. So these are all the different questions, and they're all coded the same way, right? They all have the same series of answer choices, and these variables are all ordinal, right? Because we have more or less of it going on, but we don't have exact quantities because we don't know if it's 3 or 4 times or 5 or 10 times, right? So we know that never is definitely less than once, and 5 or more times is definitely, you know, more than never, right? So it's really ordinal. We can rank their participation in delinquency as more or less, but we can't quantify it exactly. That's okay. This variable, and these series of variables, I should say, is really still very adequate for what we want to build. So I do want to take a moment just to go through a frequency in particular. So I'm on the frequency about shoplifting. And right here, it is, you know, you have the response on the left, the count or frequency of people who answered that response choice on the next column over to the right. Then you have the percent of people that responded, the proportion, right, the percent. Then you have valid percent. So the difference between percent and valid percent is percent calculates all the percentages of all responses, whether they are valid responses or missing responses, right? And what it sums up to is 100%. The valid percent is only the response categories that are valid answer choices. It does not continue to calculate the refused, don't know, not applicable, missing data, okay? And then you have cumulative percent, which actually just adds up in a series, right, until you finally get to 100%. So most people responded never to shoplifting, and then slightly more said 1 or 2 times, slightly more 3 or 4 times. And then by the time we got to the last answer choice, you always total to 100%. So if you wanted to see the percent change as you add more response categories, that's what that one is. I don't think it's terribly useful, but they do present that to us. So just to illustrate my point, let's go back up to the lying about parents. See, there are quite a few kids that have lied to their parents once or twice. Again, I rest my case. I think that's pretty normal behavior, and if you wanted to actually remove this variable from the lab, you could, but at the same time, you know, we'll keep track of it. We'll just use it for purposes of keeping things really easy. But if you wanted to not use this one in your final paper, you would kind of help make some decisions like, I don't know about that one, I'll pull that one out. But these are a good series of variables. Let's start to make our plan to build a delinquency scale, because this is going to help us run our analyses and answer our question that is our research question about predictors of delinquency. So at this point in time, we're actually building our dependent variable. So I'm going to minimize this output view, and this is something I highly encourage you to do, is this is the part where you get a Word document or a piece of paper or a notebook and start plotting out your plan. It's lots of details to keep track of, and it really does help to have a separate set of notes. So we're going to build a delinquency scale with 15 total items, and these are our 15 items. So we have the actual variable names and just the quick description of what the variable is about. Here's the entire list. We've already gone through these. And then we have that whole list coded as 0 is never, 1 is 1 or 2 times, 2 is 3 or 4 times, 3 is 5 or more times, 6, 8, and 9 are refused, don't know, and not applicable or considered missing data. So we've already been through our code book. We've identified our question wording. we've looked at our variables, we've familiarized ourselves with our data. This is the plan we want to make. So basically, we're going to take all these 15 items and give people a delinquency score. Like, how many of these things have you done? Okay? So we're going to take these codings, and because, there's a little bit of ambiguity between the categories of the ordinal variable, we're going to kind of make them all standardized. Okay? So this is the coding scheme we're going to use. We're going to take these old values and change them into these new values. So basically, in the original coding scheme, we're going to keep the never people as never, and then basically if they've done it 1 or more times, we're just going to give them a point. We don't care if you've done it once or 5 times or 20 times. We don't care. We just want to know if you've done it ever. So we're kind of transforming this variable into kind of a yes-no style variable or a nominal variable. So we're going to take those answer choices of 1, 2, and 3 and transform them into 1s. And then we'll continue to keep the missing data as is. We're going to do this same coding scheme across all 15 variables. Again, we're going to use that mass recoding technique that we looked at in the prior lab so that we can save a little bit of time and do this all at once. And again, we're also going to use that system or user missing is still missing, right? So as we plan our scale, to keep things really simple, keep the more or higher scores indicating increases in or high scores or more delinquency, right? And then you keep the less or lower scores indicating decreases, or less delinquency, and a 0 score would be no delinquency, right? And again, make sure your variables are all going the same direction, or you'll have a scale that washes itself out with inner conflict. So we have to keep everything going the right way. But because these variables are what they are, we're in pretty good shape. So again, we're going to label our new recoded variables with kind of 1 is yes, 0 is no. Our minimum lowest score will be 0, and our maximum highest score will be 15. So we'll have a scale that basically goes from 0 to 15. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our transform menu, and we're going to recode into different variables. So we're going to expand this a little bit. We're going to be working in here a lot. So I'm going to pull the corners out just so I have more of a view. I'll put my cursor inside the list, right click, and say display variable names. Now in here, we want to start typing H1DS. So once you start typing H1DS from your keyboard, there is that list of variables on delinquency, but you have to kind of type fast. Otherwise, this is a lot of scrolling to do. So we're going to go ahead and use our shift and down arrow and select all 15 of those variables and put them in our variable queue. This is where we start giving them each a name, and we can do the mass recoding sequence. So the very first variable is a variable on graffiti. So I'm just going to type the word graffiti right there, okay? And I'm going to actually just call it graffiti recoded, right? And again, I can copy and paste that same variable into the label. And again, I'm just using a right click to do that. But again, I can kind of put the details I want to keep track of different variables. I can name them whatever I want. So I'm just going to call this damage recoded. And paste it in there for the name. The third one is lying, so I'm literally just going to type lie recoded. So again, for your purpose, you can keep them super simple. You're the only one that's going to see this, so it doesn't have to be fancy. H1DS4 is actually shoplifting. And again, if I want to use 2 words, I got to use that underscore for the variable name. I don't necessarily need it for the label, but again, copying and pasting is super fast. For DS5, that is fight. And you're just going to continue doing this one at a time to get everything organized and labeled. DS6 is injuring someone. DS7 is running away. And you may notice I like to use all caps just because the font inside SPSS is Arial, it's sometimes hard to separate lowercase l's and uppercase i's, so I just like to use all caps so I don't have to worry about it. This one, DS8, is stealing a car. So I'm just going to put steal car recoded. DS9 is stealing something worth more than $50. So I'm going to say steal more than 50, recoded. And again, for purposes of the lab, you can name it what you want. DS10 is burglary. So I'm going to add that one. DS11 is threatening with a weapon. I'm just going to label this one weapon. And when you think about it, threatening with a weapon is basically assault, and it could be robbery. DS12 is selling drugs. And again, I'm just copying and pasting that same name so that I can keep track of what it is. DS13 is stealing something less than $50. So I'm going to call this steal less than 50. I could also just call this petty theft, because that's really what it is. Don't forget to hit change each time. And DS14 is group fight. And again, my final variable after I hit change is DS15, which is, I'm going to call this one loiter, because that's basically what it is. Being loud or rowdy in a public place. You're loitering. You're creating problems. And we usually only get irritated when there's big groups of kids doing it. It's kind of sad. Alright, so we'll hit change on that one as well. Alright, now we're ready to go into old and new values. And this is where we're going to check our coding scheme again. And again, it's helpful to have it on a separate document. So our coding scheme is 0 is never, 1, 2, and 3 will be a 1, and 6, 8, and 9 will be missing. So this is going to be the coding scheme that we employ. 0 becomes 0, 1, 2, and 3 become 1s, 6, 8, and 9 are missing, and then system or user missing will still be missing. So let's put that in. So let's start with 0. The value of 0 is still going to be the value of 0. Those are our never people. And now in this case we can do a range. We can do 1 through 3, and I believe it's 3, is that right? 1 through 3. Yep, that's it, 1 through 3. So 1 through 3 are going to be treated as 1s. So in the old value I do range of 1 through 3 and a new value of 1, and then hit add. And then I can use range again to handle that missing data. 6 through 9, we don't really have 7s, but 6 through 9 I can also use that way. 6 through 9 in the range is going to be system missing in the new value. And then my final entry is system or user missing will be treated as system missing. So this is our coding scheme that we're going to use for all 15 of these variables. So click continue, and then all of these are already named, and you can click OK. Alright, so it doesn't look like we did anything, although we did. And again, this is where I have to remind you. In your output, go to Edit, Options, and in the Viewer tab, ask to display the commands in the log so we can get a copy of the functions we're running in our output window, and click OK. Alright, so we went ahead and applied those recodes, but now we want to see the newly recoded variables and what they look like. So you have a full menu available to you in your output window. We're going to ask for descriptive statistics and frequencies on all these new variables. So if I kind of expand my window just a little bit by pulling on the edges, there are all my new variables. So they're at the very bottom of my data set. And if you ever don't see them, just hit the reset button, and then it'll repopulate your list. And again, the newest variables always appear at the bottom. So we're going to start with graffiti recoded, and use your shift and down arrow and grab all 15 of these and put them inside our variable queue. Then click OK. So now we have a series of frequencies that have converted all of that data into 0, 1 variables. So we need to go in and label in SPSS what the zeros and ones actually mean. So we're going to go into our data again, minimize the output view, and these are the original variables. We're going to scroll down to the very bottom of the variable view to where our new variables exist, and we're going to apply some value labels. So in the value labels column, starting with graffiti, we're going to click on the invisible blue box on the edge of the row of that column and add the plus sign for 0 is no, and add another plus sign, 1 is yes. And you can click OK. Now again, this is a little tedious because you have to do these for all of them. And I don't like, whoops, I forgot to add the yes. I can go back in, add the plus sign, 1 is yes, click OK. But I like to do this whenever I recode because sometimes I have to make tables of these variables, and again, it doesn't really matter what order they're in. I could do 1 yes, 0 no, click OK. But if I have to make tables of these variables and I need to kind of have everything labeled and organized, I want to make sure I have that in place, because if I walk away from this data, you know, and trying to come back where I left off, it might be a little confusing as to what I did. So I like to go in and as soon as I recode the variable, apply those labels, get it done quickly, so that way everything is organized and how it needs to be. So I'm just going down one row at a time, using that plus sign, adding in those value labels so I know what ones and zeros mean. And I'm, again, doing this across all 15 of these variables. 0 is no, 1 is yes. About halfway done. This is an easy step to skip, but I encourage you not to do that because it just keeps you organized to kind of have everything labeled properly right when you do it. It's just too easy to forget what everything means because you can code things in any number of ways, and keeping track of all that is very tedious. So it pays off just to take the minute or two to get everything labeled while you're doing it. So I'm on my last few, just putting in the zeros and ones for no and yes. And again, you'll notice it kind of converts 0 to like 0.00. That's okay. The default in SPSS is 2 decimal places, which you can change that if you want to, but that's kind of a good default for most data programs. So whoops. 0, value of 0 is no. Yeah, most programs use kind of that as a default, so that's kind of standard practice. All right, I'm down to my last two. 0 is no, plus sign, 1 is yes. And my final one for loitering, 0 is no, and 1 is yes. All right, so now everything is labeled. I literally could go to Analyze and then Descriptive Statistics and Frequencies, and they're all loaded in there because I just ran that frequency, and click OK, and now everything's labeled as yes, no. So I know the kids that lied and the kids that didn't. Yeah, they're lying. Just kidding. I know the kids that shoplifted and the kids that didn't. The kids getting into fights, the kids injuring people, the kids who are running away or not running away, kids that are stealing cars. It's a little alarming to look at some of these numbers, isn't it? You're like, really? There's 600 kids that have stolen a car? Wow, that seems like quite a bit. All right, so now everything is labeled and looks really good. Okay, the next thing you want to do, this is a good save point. So I would go ahead and go to File, Save As, and use your drop down to navigate to your M drive, which is your student file storage. You'll see your Gator link in there. And you might want to save, and you can name this, like whatever, lab this, or this is my data for the lab, or whatever. You can name it whatever you want, but give it a good name. You can hit save. The reason you want to save is you just made a lot of changes to your data, and if the power were to go out or the internet got dropped, you would lose all of this because the drive gets, wiped. But the M drive is forever. That is your permanent file storage that you have. But the R drive gets kind of wiped and reloaded regularly. So I don't want you to lose any of this work that you did. And I recognize many students will do labs in more than one day, right? They'll kind of do a part of a lab and then come back and finish a lab, and that's okay. So the last thing we're going to do now that we have our variables coded and labeled, we want to kind of do some quality control measures. So we're going to go to Analyze and try to put our variables side by side. So we could ask for more descriptive statistics if we wanted to, but again, there's just so many of them, right? So in here, what we may want to do instead is just go back to our output, because in our output, sorry, this is kind of a goofy view, we have, we could pick a variable like shoplifting, okay? So let's go to the original shoplifting variable, which is above. So scroll all the way up to where it asks about shoplifting. And I know that these are the kids that said I did that. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my calculator tool, and I'm going to do some quick math. So I have 914 plus 220 plus 321, okay, 1455. Okay, so that's my shoplifting result. I should have that same number of kids who are shoplifting in my new variable, right? I also should have the same amount of missing data. So let's scroll down into our new variable, and there we go. And now this is the 0, 1 variable. We can scroll down even more, kind of get the yes, no variable a little bit better. There it is, shoplifting, 1455. So I have 1455 kids that shoplifted 1, 2, or 3, 4, or 5 or more times. And then I, again, have the same numbers of missing data. So this is how you want to spot check your variables to make sure they were coded correctly. Now we could go through and actually do the math and check all these categories, because all we're really doing is reorganizing the variable. I shouldn't get any new shoplifters out of this, right? I should have the same number of shoplifters from the original and in the new variable. I'm just reorganizing them so that I can analyze them with different techniques. And you might say, well, why are we reorganizing them? If we're still getting the same number of shoplifters, what does it really matter? We're trying to combine these variables together to make a larger concept. Remember, we're measuring delinquency. So we want to be able to handle multiple behaviors inside one measure. But again, you could check your variables, but because the same logic and the same coding scheme was applied to all of these variables, we can be pretty confident that looking at a little sampling of how we coded something, that the rest of these are probably in pretty good shape, right? But you could actually spot check and review the categories in math and just make sure that all of those categories are summing up properly, and that when they're reorganized, they're all in the right place. But again, for sake and purpose of the lab, we're going to go ahead and move forward and assume that these variables are in good shape. So I'm going to minimize my calculator and close my output. We're now ready to build our scale. So I'm going to go to the Transform menu and Compute Variable. So the variable I'm going to make is a delinquency underscore scale. Whoops, I need to type well. And you can see it has an equal sign next to it, so we're going to build a numeric expression that sums those items together into a scale. And it's going to equal this scale. So we're going to put together basically our little formula. So again, I'm going to expand the window a little bit so you can see things better. But I'm going to start with my graffiti recoded variable, which is at the very bottom of the list, because those are all our new variables we just made. And I'm going to use the arrow and put it in the numeric expression. Then I'm going to hit the plus sign. Then I'll go to my next variable, damage. Then hit the plus sign. The live variable, plus sign. The shoplifting variable, plus sign. The fighting variable, plus sign. So I'm going to continue to add each of these variables one at a time into the equation and separate each of them with the plus sign until I get them all added together. Now if you mess up and you forget to do a plus sign, or you have to edit anything, you can type into this numeric expression anytime you want and go do that. Or maybe you did one variable twice and you got to go get rid of it. Completely editable. It's fine. Alright, so I'm almost done. I have my group fighting, and finally my loitering variable. Alright, so I should have all 15 variables in there in the numeric expression. And again, you can look it over before you click OK, just to make sure you didn't leave any out. But we have all of them in here, so we're going to click OK. Now again, at the bottom of your output, we have some commands that said, hey, I just built your scale. I computed a delinquency scale composed of these variables, and I executed this function. This is the syntax command script. It also shows that we saved our file and the location we saved it at. So this is, again, just a running data log of the steps you've taken and changes you've made to your data. But we want to go look at this scale, so we need to go run a frequency. Okay? So first, let's label it. Let's scroll down to the bottom. You can now see that here we have a new variable. On row 8113, we have a delinquency scale. So we're going to go ahead and label it in the label field. And again, you can use spaces in this field. It's perfectly fine. We are not going to give it value labels because the number is the amount, the quantity or amount of delinquency happening. So it does not get labeled, as is the case with most interval ratio variables. So we basically took all of our ordinal variables that gave us kind of highs and lows or more and less delinquency going on. We recoded them and converted them into nominal variables and basically quantified them as a group into a delinquency scale. So now we have an interval variable summing all of those individual category responses together. So now we have a variable that measures an amount of delinquency across all these different behaviors that a kid does. So let's go ahead and run a frequency on our new variable, which is Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and the Frequencies menu. We're going to go ahead and highlight. We'll use the down shift key. We'll put all these variables back because we're done with them. Again, SPSS likes to be super convenient. It's not always the case, but you can also reset your menu if you don't see your new scale there. But I see it down here at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and select it, use my arrow key to put it in. And actually, I'm going to ask for some additional statistics. I'm going to ask for the mean, median, mode, the standard deviation, the range, the minimum, and the maximum. And then click Continue and click OK. All right, so here is our delinquency scale. So right here, these are the average amount of delinquency, right? Mean, median, and mode. A lot of kids said never, so that's why the mode is 0. So most kids are not very delinquent, thank goodness, right? But the mean and median are pretty similar, right? They're about 2 or 2.7. We also can see the range goes from 0 to 15, right? So there actually is an amount of kids that did all 15 of those things. That kind of blows my mind. So there are 6 kids out of the 6,504 that said, yep, I did every single one of those things. Sometimes your delinquency scale doesn't go all the way to the top number because no one happened to respond in that manner across all your items. But in this case, there actually are 6 kids that did, right? So, and then these are all the other scores in between. So these are the kids' responses, giving them 1 point apiece across 15 behaviors. These are how the scores run. So it makes sense to us that most kids do 1 or 2 things, right? So that's a big chunk of the data. 22% did none of those 15. 19% did 1 of the 15. 15% did 2, and so on and so forth. So most kids might just do a couple of those delinquent behaviors, but maybe not many more. And then, a little group in the middle here has done, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things. Very few kids, when we look at, what's left, have really done 10 or more delinquent acts, right? So the unit of analysis for this scale is number of delinquent acts. How many of these delinquent activities have you done from 0 to 15? You could even recode this scale if you wanted to into like a high, medium, low, none. So your 0 kids would be your none. The kids maybe between 1 and 4 would be your low. Kids between maybe 5 and 9 would be the medium. And then I would say 10 and above would be kind of the high, right? So you can have you could recode this and have varying levels of delinquency. But I would keep this variable as is because you have a lot of great variation in here and its quantities, and that gives us lots of mathematical properties to work with to do analyses with. But yeah, you could even take these numbers in this variable and code them again if you wanted to, right? Or you also could say, I just want to know if they're delinquent or not, if they've done 1 or more. I don't care how many they've done, I just want to know if they've done 1 or more. So you could recode the scale, again, if you wanted to, and make 1 through 15 a 1, and 0 a 0, and you could just have a delinquency variable that's delinquent, yes, no. And you're like, well, what does that matter? Well, it would give you coverage across 15 items. It collapses all these scores into have you done it or not necessarily how many have you done. But again, those are just different ways you can measure things. We're not going to do that in the lab, but I'm just giving you different ideas if you want to work with data like this. At this point in the lab, you also may notice that it's kind of short. There's not as many question prompts to get after all the steps that you've done and the things you've created in the data. And again, you can save this output if you want to, going File, Save As, and save it to the M drive if you would like. All right, so we would go here, navigate to the M drive, and you can save it wherever you want. I'm not going to do that for now, but I may want to save my data because I just built a delinquency scale and I don't want to lose it. You can always recreate output, but you can't always recreate data. So we're going to go to our M drive, our temporary storage, and hit save. Do I want to replace it? Yes. Okay, so now I have all my newest stuff I just made. Now, in this kind of lab, this builds on previous skills you've already done. So you've already built scales in prior labs. You've run frequencies, you've recoded variables. So you should be getting pretty good at these kinds of skills. I don't prompt you quite as much with these kinds of skills and steps because the idea for this class is to build on existing knowledge and experience, right? So we're just really getting after a variable we need to build and then getting after the analysis we need to do. But all of those steps that would be in previous labs, like tell me how you coded this variable, how are the value labels, what changes did you make, is your variable correct, what does your variable measure, how are you going to build your scale? There are reasons I ask you those things in the lab, because when I prompt you for that information, I'm getting all kinds of detail that I need to write a methods section. So you have to tell your reader what variables you're using, how they are organized, the questions that are asked, and any codes or coding schemes you use to make changes to them, recoding you did, scales you built. You have to describe all that in your section so your reader knows how all these variables were organized and how they worked. You also have to prepare tables of your data, like frequencies, to show them the data you have and what you're working with so they can become familiar with the variables you're going to analyze. So I'm very methodical about how I teach this class to kind of prompt you with documenting your steps and making your plan, because you have to write about it later. So it is very helpful to have your notebook or your post-it notes or your documents organized so that if you have to reference those in writing up the sections of what you did, you have them handy. So within our lab, we want to answer a research question, right? Just like you want to answer one in your paper. We want to predict how much delinquency a child commits by knowing other things about them, their gender, their age, and when they have their first drink of alcohol. So essentially, we want to know if being male or female is predictive of delinquency, and we want to know if being an early drinker, their age when they have their first drink, is also a predictor of delinquency, right? We need to prepare variables for analysis and run a regression, right? So we already did this next step, creating a delinquency scale, and in that case, delinquency is our dependent variable. But now we need to work with two other variables, which are gender and age. So usually in a research question, the very first variable mentioned is the focal relationship, or the variable of interest. That is the main independent variable, in this case, gender. Subsequent variables that are asked afterwards are usually control variables, or variables that you're also interested in, but is not the main focus of the paper. So again, we're predicting delinquency, the dependent, with gender, the independent, and controlling for age at first drink. That's essentially the research question we're going to be trying to answer. So we're going to get back into our data and start working with our two other variables prior to analysis. We will start with the first variable of gender, and we've already looked in the codebook. We're going to press our cursor into the name field and do a Control F. This variable in the AdHealth dataset is bio_sex, short for biological sex. We're going to hit Find Next, and then we can click Close. So it's on row 9, it's at the very top of the dataset, and it makes sense. It's one of the earlier variables. Usually it's one of those first questions you're asked, either at the very beginning or very end of a survey, because it's simple, what's your gender, right? So here's the variable on row 9, and we're going to go ahead and run a quick frequency of that variable. So I'm going to right-click and ask for descriptive statistics. In this case, I have 3,174 males, 3,356 females. Does it matter I have slightly more females than males? No, not really, not for our purposes. This is perfectly fine and really good variance for this variable. Now again, I know there are different gender identities that we could possibly measure, but for purposes of the lab, we're going to use this gender variable. We also have one person that said missing or refused, but most people responded with their gender on this survey, and so has very little missing data. So this gender variable is actually pretty good as far as having complete cases to analyze. The other thing we need to look at is the value label. So I'm going to minimize the output and go ahead and click on that invisible blue button on the edge of the values column for biological sex. And I can see that 1 is male, 2 is female, and 6 is refused. So we're actually going to recode this variable because we want to make a kind of different sort of comparison. Now when you think about it, if you've taken other criminology classes, we've already studied gender effects when it comes to delinquency and crime. By and large, the science says that males commit more crime and delinquency than females do. Now we want to run our own test to see if we're right and see if our data and our study agrees with the science. If we find out something different than that, and all the rest of the studies say there is a relationship, then something might be wrong. But we want to do our own test and see if we can find proof of that relationship between gender and criminality. So in this case, we are more interested in females and comparing females to males because we know females commit less delinquency than males. So again, just by virtue of review, we're going to go ahead and talk about a dummy variable. It's very common to make a dummy variable out of gender or out of race. Now remember, we used that 0-1 coding scheme, and we really made dummy variables out of the delinquency variables too, right? With you did it, you didn't do it, right? Yes, no. Same kind of a thing here, but in this case, we're going to decide for our dummy variable that 1 is the presence of something, the response group we're interested in, and 0 is the absence of something, the response group we're setting aside or comparing to. So in this case, we're actually going to make females our 1, we're going to make males our 0. So we have a little bit of recoding to do. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into the data, and we have to set up a coding scheme to deal with this. So maybe you can do these steps on your own, and you don't need Dr. Jensen to walk you through, but I'll help you just in case. So we know that males are 1 and females are 2, and 6 is refused. That's pretty simple, and we can probably remember that. So we're going to hit cancel, and we're going to go ahead and go into transform, recode into different variables, and we can put all these back. And again, I'm using my shift key, and I can just grab these and put these back because we're not working with them anymore. And again, this is just SPSS being convenient by saving the last thing that we did. So we'll put all these back. And then we'll go grab the gender variable. So remember that variable was right at the top, so we can scroll all the way up and go select biosex and then use the arrow to put it in our variable queue. So we're going to call this variable gender, or you literally could name it the groups you're comparing to, right? So for name, I'm going to put gender. For label, I'm going to do females versus males. So you can put little prompts in there for the label. Again, you're the only one seeing this data, but you might need to remind yourself how you set the variable up. So you can use these labels to kind of give yourself some key shortcuts or notes so that you can say, okay, this is how I set up this variable, this is how it's going to go. And now I'm going to go to old and new values, and the value of 1 in the original variable was for males. I'm going to make that a new value of 0. And then I'm going to hit add. Now remember, all the old coding scheme from the delinquency variable is still in there, so we're going to go ahead and remove that. So I'm going to remove the 1 through 3, the 6 through 9, the missing data, and the zeros. Okay, so I still have the one I just put in there, right? Males as a 1 are now going to be treated as a 0. Does it mean males are missing data? No, it just means we're setting them aside with a different marker so we can make a comparison. So we're very much still analyzing males. They are not excluded from the variable. We're making them be different than the females so we can test for that difference. The next variable we're going to look at, or value, is a 2, which would be in the original variable females, and we're going to make them a value of 1. And again, you could do this the other way around if you wanted to. If you wanted to compare males to females, you could do the same thing. You keep 1 is 1 and 2 is 0. You could do that. So it just depends on what comparison you're interested in. There's really no right or wrong way. You get to decide as a researcher how you want to do it. But so far we have, this is our coding scheme. And again, I think it had a 6 over here as missing data. Those are the refused people. And then again, we're going to use that system or user missing in the old value and treat it as system missing in the new value. So our coding scheme for gender should look like this. 1 is turning into 0, 2 is turning into 1, 6 and missing data will be treated as system missing. And again, those are just non-responses, blanks, refused. If they were not there to be analyzed in the original variable, we're still not going to do much with them in the new. So we'll hit continue and then change and then click OK. Again, so you just have the syntax script saying that that function was run, but we need to run the frequency of the new variable. So we're going to go ahead and go to Analyze and ask for descriptive statistics and frequencies. There's our delinquency scale. That's the last thing we ran. We're going to put that back. And we're going to go get our gender variable that we just made, which is now our newest variable at the bottom of the list. Then we can scroll all the way back up. We're going to put one more variable in here, biological sex. We're going to stack that one in there using that arrow button together. And we're going to put those two side by side so we can check them, then click OK. So right here, we have biological sex. Now, it might not be easy to make the comparison because we haven't labeled our old variable yet. Let's go ahead and do that now. So we're going to go back in the data set. Again, scroll all the way down to the very last row because that's our latest variable we just made. And we'll go here and click on that invisible blue box at the edge of the values column. Do the plus sign. Again, a 1 is female. And click OK. Whoops. Go back in there using that invisible blue box. Add the 0 as males. Again, this is just identifier. Now click OK. And now everybody should be labeled. Let's go ahead and go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics and Frequencies. We'll check these two variables one more time. Click OK. There, now everybody's labeled. So again, we reorganized the variable, giving them kind of different categories or different markers or flags, but we still should have 3,147 males in the new variable as we did in the original variable for biological sex. So we're not getting any new males or females out of this, right? We're just kind of reorganizing them with different markers. Okay, so we can kind of make the comparison we're interested in for the research. All right, so right there we have our gender variable kind of ready to go out of the box. So this would be a really good save point. So you might want to go back to your data and do File, Save As, go to your M drive, and save the file. Do you want to replace this file? You can rename it, or you can call it something else, whatever you want to do. I'm going to go ahead and click Yes, so I save my variable. So we're ready to start working with our next variable, which is age at first drink. So we're going to go ahead and minimize our output, and we'll go back into our data, put your cursor into the label field and hit Control F, and we're going to search on the word alcohol and hit Find Next. Now this one says, how often do you drink and drive? Not interested in that one. Have you drinking alcohol more than 2 or 3 times? No. Drinking outside your family? Aha, I hit Find Next a couple of times. I'm going to close this now. I get to row 1758 right here, which is age that you first drank alcohol. So we're going to go ahead and right click on this and ask for descriptive statistics to check it out. So this is age in years that you had your first drink. Okay, so we know that drinking at a very young age can be kind of problematic for kids, and it can be a gateway to other behaviors and possibly even other drug use, especially since alcohol is pretty freely available in homes or from friends. So this is kind of the range and ages that everybody drank alcohol. You may want to take a moment to think about this variable because really it's an interval variable, right? Age in years that I had my first drink. So I have an age or an amount of how old I am that I had my first drink of alcohol, right? And so I don't need to really recode it. I can put it into my analysis as is, unless I'm only interested in certain ages, right? So if I only wanted to look at kids that were younger than 10, I could actually take this variable and recode it as 1 through 10 is a 1, making them a yes, I drank before I was 10 years old, and then make everybody else a 0, saying I drank at a later age, and so on and so forth, right? Or you also have some missing data down here that you'd have to pay attention to, like this one, legitimate skip. I haven't had a drink of alcohol or drunk when I'm not with my parents, right? So there's some qualifiers with this question that, again, you want to pay attention to in the code book that said, it's not like you're having a sip of wine at the table with mom and dad over dinner, right? Like this is you kind of starting your first drinking journey as a kid, right? That's really what this one's about. But yeah, so if I was interested in certain age groups, I could code it and rearrange it a little bit, but I don't want to do that. I actually want to leave this variable as is because I'll be able to do really cool analysis with it to see how their age increases or decreases, right? and what happens to their delinquency to see if anything special is going on there. So this variable is fine and ready to go out of the box. I don't have to recode anything. If I go back into the data and I minimize the output view, I can see that they've already kind of handled the missing data pretty well. The legitimate skips, the refuse, the I don't knows, they actually have those defined in the missing column. So I don't need to really worry about that either. So I'm now ready to perform my analysis. Before we do that, I'm going to show you a little trick that I do with variables all the time. So again, I have my cursor on row 1758. Because this is such a long list of variables, H1TO14, it can be a lot of scrolling, a little bit hard to find whenever I select variables from a list. So I'm actually going to just kind of click over the name of this variable, and I'm going to just put in kind of a placeholder. I'm going to call it zdrunk. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to change the name so it's easy to spot. And if I put a Z in front of it, I can sort it to the bottom of my list alphabetically and find it really easy. I'm the only one using the data, so as long as I remember I changed H1TO14 to zdrunk, and that way I know how to find it and how to use it, that's totally fine. So now I'm going to go ahead and start my analysis. So remember, in this case, the question that we are asking is right here. So we want to know how much delinquency a child commits by knowing their gender and their age at first drink. So in order to analyze 3 or more variables, we have to run an OLS regression. So we're going to go to Analyze, and then Regression, and Linear. So that pulls up this menu here. This is the technique we run. The reason we know we're running an OLS regression or an ordinary least squares regression is because my dependent variable is interval. It's a quantity or an amount, and it has a lot of good variation, and it's continuous, right? You can have an unlimited amount of delinquency out there, right? Now we know you can't have like a gazillion delinquent acts. You probably wouldn't be alive anymore. But in theory, you could go up until infinity, right? So the first thing we're going to do is scroll all the way down and go get our delinquency scale that we just made. So we were literally building our dependent variable. We're going to use that arrow and put it in the dependent box. Now we need to go select our predictor variables. So the first one we're going to go get is gender, and we're going to put that one at the top. And then we're going to go grab our second variable, which is the drinking variable. So in here, I'm going to right-click inside my variable list and hit Display Variable Names, and then I'm going to right-click one more time and say Sort Alphabetically. If I scroll all the way down, my zdrunk should be at the bottom, very easy to find, and I'm going to use my arrow key to also insert that in my independence block box. So I'm going to kind of stack the variables one after the other here in the box. So usually we put your focal relationship first, your main independent variable, and then you can stick your control variables underneath so that you can see kind of how they all work together. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to ask for descriptive statistics, so I'm going to press that statistics option box and select descriptives over here as a checkbox. Then click Continue, and now click OK. So here I now have a series of new pieces of output to analyze and interpret for my research result. So right here, the first thing I see is regression, right? I have descriptive statistics, and look, I also have some syntax that shows me what I ran. So you could actually take this and copy and paste it and stick it in a syntax editor and then run it over and over and over again if you wanted to without having to navigate a single menu. I like to do that, but anyway, I'm kind of a nerd. So anyway, regression's right here, and here is the, these are the means of each of the variables individually. So the mean delinquency scale is 3.8, right? That's the average number of delinquent acts a kid does. The mean is not terribly useful for males and females because, like, what's the mean of gender, right? We don't have an average gender, right? So we're not terribly surprised that the mean between 0 and 1 is 0.5, right? But again, what does that actually tell us? Not anything useful. So the mean for a nominal variable is kind of not helpful at all. So we kind of ignore that one. But the mean of the age at first drinking alcohol, now that is pretty useful. The average age that a kid first has their drink of alcohol is 13.3 years old. So, and again, we also have kind of the N, or the number of kids we're analyzing in the total regression. So in this regression, we're analyzing 2,518 kids. Now remember, this data set had about 6,500 kids in it. And you're going, okay, where'd the other kids go? Well, if you're asking kids to respond to multiple things, it's going to put some constraints on your data. As far as missing data, they have to answer all those questions in order to be considered in the analysis. So your sample size tends to get smaller and smaller the more demands you put on your equation. Okay, so again, you get a correlation whenever you run a regression because we have to calculate Pearson's R in order to run the regression product and equation to get all those pieces. But what I want you to do is scroll all the way down into the very bottom of your output when you see model summary. So right here, the first part is model summary. That gives you your R squared value. The next part you actually get an ANOVA or an analysis of variance. But the final part is where we do the most moving and shaking. These are the coefficients, because remember, you're literally graphing a line, and your coefficients represent the slope of that line, or the slope as it contributes to what the line shape looks like when you're trying to create a line that represents the relationship between delinquency and these other variables. So we'll start to walk through this output one piece at a time. So a few hints for you is a lot of people like to take this output and just kind of screen grab it or copy and paste it into a Word document so they have just the components that they need to start working on their interpretation, and then they're not scrolling around forever in miles and miles of output trying to find their regression, right? Because they're really only needing these few pieces, and it kind of keeps it a little more organized. So if you wanted to do so and just park it in a Word document, that's fine. But I'm going to take this moment to review the 4 pieces of information that we report in order to write the statistical and substantive results of our research question. Okay, so remember, the dependent variable is delinquency scale, and it actually reminds you of that kind of right underneath some of this output. It says, hey, guess what? Your dependent variable is a delinquency scale. Okay, but the 4 pieces you're going to write about are, number 1, do you have significant relationships between the model variables and the dependent variable? Do they predict the delinquency scores that people are getting? Number 2, you're also going to report on the constant. Now, occasionally you can get a constant that's not as meaningful when it comes to your research question, or even a negative constant. But in this case, we actually do have a meaningful constant, and we'll talk about what that is later. The third thing that you report is you talk about the B coefficients, and in this case we use the unstandardized B's. Those, again, are the slope of your line as it contributes to graphing the relationship between your X and your Y, or delinquency and a series of X's, gender and how old you are when you first drink alcohol. And then the final thing you report is located in the model summary, which is the R squared. And that tells you about how much variation you're covering in explaining the dependent variable or delinquency, which is covered by the model variables or the group of independent variables you're analyzing. So those 4 things, the significance, the constant, the B coefficients, and the R squared. Those are the things you want to focus upon in your interpretation. So we're going to walk through each of these components step by step, and I kind of typed it up in a document which you can kind of mimic or copy a little bit as you get used to the wording, the language, and description of how we talk about these pieces. So this is a little bit of an infusion between the statistical components and the substantive, or what does it mean in English stuff. So we're going to go ahead and change the screen and flip back and forth between the output that we have here as well as the interpretation. So first of all, I determined that there is a strong negative relationship between a juvenile's gender and the delinquency they commit. Okay, so first of all, we can tell that the gender variable here has triple zeros, right? So in your case, when we look at your coefficients, it says P is less than 0.001. So right there, bring your eyes to the very end of the coefficients box and see if your variables are significant. And again, the female versus male variable is line 2. So we can tell that gender is a significant variable when it comes to predicting delinquency. We can also see that the age they first drink alcohol is also a significant predictor of delinquency too. So we have 2 significant relationships at play here. They each have their own coefficient, and they can be positive or negative when it comes to OLS regression. So we're going to walk through those as well. We have a constant of 7.733. Now this is a good time in the lab to say, do you have the same output that I do? If you do not, then something went terribly wrong in the lab, and you'll want to work with your lab partner, myself, or the teaching assistants to try to troubleshoot what happened. More than likely it's an error in your recoding efforts, so you'll want to check through that information to see if there's any issues there. But let's go back to our interpretation. So right here, we have a relationship between gender and delinquency, And then we come to that constant of 7.733. The constant, or approximate mean score of a delinquency a kid commits on average, is 7.73 acts. So again, knowing nothing about a kid, we would predict that they commit about 7 delinquent acts out of the 15. But now knowing things about them, like their gender or how old they are when they first start drinking, we should be able to get a better predictor of how delinquent they are because we have more information about them that we can use to make those predictions. So if we just had the constant, which again, a constant inside a slope of a line is really just going to tell you what the y value is when x is 0. So if x is 0, it means I have no independent variables in the equation. So what would the average amount of delinquency be not knowing anything about a kid? Well, it would be about 7, right? That's what that's literally telling you. And then finally, I can go on again to that first independent variable. Females have a statistically significant relationship with delinquency completed as compared to males, right? So I have that relationship. Then I go into the coefficients. So remember, females had negative 1.066. So females have a negative coefficient of negative 1.066 acts, or are scoring lower than males. This means that girls are committing 1 less delinquent act than boys. So this is how their delinquency score changes given their group membership. Now remember, when you're interpreting nominal variables on an OLS regression, you're literally switching from the 1 category to the 0 category. Because when we interpret variables on x, it's the change in x over the change in y, right? That's a slope. So we want to know how that slope changes for one group versus another. And when you do a 1 unit change in x, turning into this subsequent change in y, the 1 unit change is going from 0 to 1. It's going male to female, right? So we want to know how females are different than males. And basically everything under the B column, that's the y. That is delinquency. So those are actual delinquency scores given the independent variable. So we know that females are scoring 1 act lower than males. They have a negative 1, so they have less delinquency than the boys do, right? So that's kind of what that coefficient actually means. And then we'll move on to the next relationship. We already said it was significant. The next relationship is the drinking variable, right? And we can continue here. Another significant relationship is present with the age a juvenile has their first drink of alcohol. For every 1 year in age that a child refuses to drink alcohol for the first time, they actually commit 0.249 fewer delinquent acts. And you can even put the B coefficient in there, the negative 2.4 or 0.249. So this means that as children postpone the age that they have their first drink, they tend to participate in less delinquency. Okay? This relationship is also highly statistically significant at the p is less than 0.001 level. So again, let's go back to that output, right? So I will minimize this. We have that p-value of negative 0.249. So when it comes to the drinking variable, we always do a 1 unit change in x compared to this subsequent change in y. So a 1 unit change is aging by 1 year. This is an interval variable, so it's a quantity. And so for every additional year a child ages, we get a decrease in their delinquency of negative 0.249, or about 1/4 of a point, right? So because our delinquency scale is measured in points. So it's kind of strange to say you do 1/4 of a delinquent act less if you are getting older when you have your first drink. It's a little strange to say that. So we have to kind of word it in a way that makes sense. So again, going back to our interpretation, so we can literally say that for every additional year that a kid is not starting to drink, they're doing less delinquency. So basically kids that are quite young are doing the most delinquency if they were early drinkers. That's really what the value is telling us. Okay? The final interpretation that we do is the R-squared value. So I'm going to minimize this for a moment and bring your eyes to this model summary area up here. So you always look at the R-squared value of 0.080. And that value tells you what the variance explained in the model is. That's why it's under the model summary box. So we're going to bring up that interpretation so we can walk you through that. The R-squared value of 0.080 indicates that only 8%, because literally you can take that number and multiply it by 100 and get a percent of variance explained. Only 8% of the variance in explaining delinquency committed can be accounted for by the model variables, which would be gender and their age at first drink. So we're not getting a lot of coverage or a lot of mileage out of these variables. So yes, knowing their gender and how old they are when they first start drinking is useful. They do have significant relationships, and they do have coefficients that tell us that certain genders do less delinquency, and delaying the age you drink makes you less delinquent. Those are all, useful pieces of information, but how important are they at really explaining delinquency? Not very, right? Because really the R-squared value is kind of how much does this matter? How important is it? Well, it only covers about 8% of all the different kinds of things that could be used to explain delinquency. So I kind of always end with this sentence. This tells us that there are likely other factors which contribute more to the explanation of how much delinquency a kid commits, right? So there's other things that are more predictive of it. And I'll tell you right now, one of the best predictors of delinquency is having delinquent friends. It's kind of the whole birds of a feather flock together argument. And you'll see this theory put forward by Ron Akers, who also used to be a Florida Gator. He was in our department for a long time. So it's the social learning theory, right? And this is why your parents cared so much about who you hung out with. It's highly predictive of you getting into trouble. And I'll tell you right now, most of the really stupid stuff that I did as a kid was because of me hanging out with stupid friends. And I think that's pretty common across a lot of people. But that literally is a write-up of what we learned. And again, you can pause the video and kind of look over this wordage so you can kind of get a more complete version of it to explain all these little coefficients, all the significance levels, the R-squared value, the constant. It's all in there. So if you need to pause the video and kind of go back and walk through the interpretations of all the pieces, feel free to do that. So this final part of the lab is most important because we are literally taking SPSS output and bringing it back to the reader or the audience in a research report that says, hey, we're trying to answer a question if gender and age at first drinking alcohol is predictive of delinquency. Did we find that out? Yes, we did. We find out they are significant. This is how those relationships actually work, because that's what regression tells us. Not only did these things matter, but this is how those relationships work. This is how the increases or decreases in delinquency happen by virtue of these predictive variables. And this is kind of what it means as far as how important it is. So we've just answered a lot of different questions as a part of our research. But yeah, that interpretation is super, super important. And it takes some practice to kind of get used to how to handle coefficients, how to look at significance levels, reminding yourself what an R-squared value tells us or what the constant means. I know that this is kind of new math for a lot of people. It's got a lot of moving parts. But again, kind of doing this exercise over and over again, you get more comfortable with this language and how it works and what's going on. But if you have any questions about this lab and how to make these interpretations, feel free to reach out to me, your lab partner, or the teaching assistants, and we can do some more practice together or answer your questions. So hopefully you found this lab helpful. And again, you might want to save output or save your data so you don't lose any work. And we'll see you on the next lab.